Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first class for this Calgary Bible Institute for our fall semester, Apologetics and Worldview. I'm Dr. Michael Miller, one of the pastors at Foundation, and we're really glad that you found us here online and hope that tonight and the rest of the course this semester will be a help to you as you think through your worldview, and also to help you to be able to defend your faith better. So we're glad that you're here. I want to start by talking about what a worldview is. What is a worldview? A worldview is basically a way of seeing our planet. It's a set of beliefs. It's a foundational set of assumptions that affect how you view the world and how you interact with our world. It's a set of belief that determines how you view our planet and the people, the petunias, and the possums on it. And that's an allusion to a creature that I don't think we have in Canada. One time I was talking about possums, and a lot of people didn't even know what they are. They're really ugly. I'm sure God created them for a purpose, but you'd often find them dead on the road down in South Carolina. But how do you view your planet? Well, that's determined by your worldview. James Sire is an apologist. He's passed away now, but his book, The Universe Next Door, you'll see that I reference this here tonight in your notes and the footnotes. But he defines worldview this way, and it's lengthy, but it's a good definition. He says a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of propositions. And he points out that these assumptions that you have based on your worldview may be true, they may be partially false, or they may be entirely false. You may be believing a total lie. He goes on that we adhere to them consciously or subconsciously. In other words, we may not even be aware of our worldview, but it's there. And we may hold it consistently or inconsistently. Our practice may betray something else about the basic constitution of reality that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. In other words, it affects everything about us. A simpler definition of a worldview is provided in the textbook that we are using together this summer, or this fall, Biblical Worldview, edited by Mark Ward. And Mark defines a worldview as a set of basic beliefs, assumptions, and values. So that's the first component. What do you believe? What's your foundation for knowledge? The second component that Mark gives us is which arises from a big story about the world. Worldviews talk about why we're here, where we came from, and where we are going. And some worldviews have a captivating big story. A meta-narrative is a fancier word for it. And other worldviews don't. Then the third component, it produces individual and group action, human culture. So it not only affects the way we view our planet, it affects what we do on our planet together with those who are around us. So there are some basic worldview realities. And the first is that everybody has a worldview. Everybody on our planet has a worldview. Anybody who can think conscious thoughts has a worldview. But the reality is that not everyone is aware of their worldview, and that's what Mr. Sire was pointing out when he says consciously or subconsciously. He's not delving into the pseudoscience of Freud's subconscious there. What he's talking about is that everyone has a worldview, but not everyone recognizes or is aware of what their worldview is. So your neighbor has a worldview, but they may not be able to articulate that to you. They can't put it into propositional statements. They can't say, this is my worldview, this is what I believe, but they believe something. They have a worldview. And a good analogy for a worldview is a lens. Glasses lenses or contact lenses. At first, when you get the new lenses, you're very aware of them, but over time, they become imperceptible to you where you don't even notice the lenses anymore. Ward explains, if you wear glasses or contacts, you might remember when you first put them on. The world looked sharper, but your new seeing apparatus felt awkward. You were very aware of it. Maybe the contacts made your eyes water, or the frames on your glasses distracted you by their shape and color. But it's unlikely that this feeling lasted very long. By now, you're so used to your lenses that you don't see them at all. Instead, you see through them. I remember when I got glasses in grade 7, I was sitting in science class with Miss Ball, and she assigned me a seat towards the back of the room, and I could not read what she was writing up on our green chalkboard. And so my parents took me and got tested, and sure enough, I needed glasses. Well, a little bit later, my parents ventured into the world of contacts for me. That would be helpful, enjoying playing sports as I did. And so back then, the predominant contact lens was a 1-year contact lens. So I can remember in our house at 15 Tassel Trail in Greenville, South Carolina, in our bathroom, practicing putting the contact lenses in, and it was hard at first. I could hardly do it, and sometimes I even ripped them, which was a lot of money down the drain, literally, with a contact lens that was supposed to last for a year, and my parents were very gracious in replacing them when I did that. But at first, everything is very intentional with contact lenses. You have to think about which eyelid do you pull up, when, how do you put it in, and you make a lot of mistakes. And at first, you notice them a lot, but then over time, unless it's really dry like here in Alberta, you get to the point where you don't even notice them. They're affecting how you see the world. You're seeing the world differently through those lenses, but you don't even know that they're there most of the time. That's a great analogy for a worldview. Your neighbor, your coworkers, your family, and you are all seeing the world through the lens of your worldview. And after time, you don't even realize what's happening. It's just second nature to you. So everybody has a worldview, but not everybody is aware of what their worldview is. A third reality about worldviews is that not everyone questions the validity of their worldview. In other words, many people choose not to examine the evidence for their worldview. They have these assumptions that they've been taught or they've bought into, maybe from sitting under a professor, and they really haven't bothered to examine the evidence for their worldview. Perhaps it's laziness. Perhaps it's fear. They don't want to know if their worldview is accurate or not. Or it might just be that they've never even thought about it. And many people choose their worldview not just for intellectual reasons, that I believe this best deals with the data that I see around me and that I have experienced in my own life. But for deeply emotional reasons, they settle on a worldview. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, for instance, an unbeliever who has lost a child. A child dies tragically, and this unbeliever who at one time believed in the existence of God, but decides they no longer believe in God. Why? Not for intellectual reasons primarily, but for emotional reasons. They're hurt. They don't understand. Maybe they're angry at God and they don't want to believe in a God that would allow that in their lives. So it's not just an intellectual thing, it's deeply emotional for a lot of people. Fourth reality about worldview is that not everybody lives out their professed worldview. And this is true for even us who claim a biblical or Christian worldview. We don't always practice what we preach. Some live quite inconsistently with what they claim to believe. So, for instance, if you're a naturalist and you believe that we're here as a result of the Big Bang, random chance, and yet you decide to do something very loving and caring for another person, even to your own detriment, sacrificing for the good of another person, you are actually living inconsistently with your worldview. And I'm glad that you do, but you're living inconsistently with the naturalistic worldview. And sometimes we as believers claim that, well, we believe everybody's made in the image of God, and then we don't treat them like that. So we're inconsistent in our worldviews. Everybody is to a certain extent. Some people blend various worldviews together and make up their own. You may look at the worldviews that are listed here a little bit later, and your neighbor couldn't pick out one that they adhere to, but they take what they want to believe from these various arenas of philosophy or religion, and they patchwork together what they want based on what's important to them. Maybe pleasure is important to them. Fifth reality is that every worldview has its own presuppositions. A presupposition are ideas that you have preformed, things that you believe, and you come into a discussion or you come to examine evidence with these presuppositions in tow. We like to think that we're totally neutral and objective, but nobody is. Somebody might suggest, well, you can't come to the right conclusion unless you're completely objective, and that's false. No person, whether we like it or not, is completely objective. We all have presuppositions. The adherent of Islam comes to the table with presuppositions. The New Ager comes to the table with presuppositions. The existentialist comes to the table with presuppositions. None of us come with a blank mind and a totally neutral perspective, nor can we, nor should we. We can't rid ourselves of presuppositions. The key is, do you come to the table with the right presuppositions? Do you come to the table believing that man is an accident? Or that God is, nature is God? Pantheism, that God is physically in everything. Word explains, according to the Bible, knowledge is moral. You know either obediently or rebelliously. The answer then is not to get rid of your presuppositions, but to have good ones. You want to have the right presuppositions if you're going to come to the correct worldview conclusions. And that leads us to the next reality, is that every worldview requires faith. Every worldview requires faith. A lot of people in our day want to claim that they believe in the scientific method and that's their worldview, and so they are completely objective. It's just science. Or for other person, a rationalist, it may be reason. And they would suggest that their view is superior to our Christian view because they don't believe any religious dogmas. They're neutral, or they're relying on the scientific method. Well, first of all, science is not a worldview. It's just a way of studying our world. A rationalist might think, well, my worldview is rational and true because I stay away from religious beliefs. But what I want to point out to you is that every worldview rests on faith assumptions. So, for instance, naturalism, many people believe that the Big Bang started what we see. And they come to the table with that assumption. It's not provable, That's a faith assumption. They're taking that on the authority of somebody else's word. And really that's what happens in a worldview is we usually rest on the authority of another person, of somebody that we trust. So if you trust Richard Dawkins or Charles Darwin, then you're going to take a lot of what they say with authority. Or how about postmodernism that just saturates our day, that truth is relative, you can determine truth for yourself, influencing the view that there are so many different ways to God, you just choose the one that's best for you. Well, that's a faith assumption. That's a presupposition. It's the wrong presupposition. Because everybody has the same evidence. We may not all have access to it equally, but the data is the same for everybody. So why do adherents of different worldviews disagree? It's not the evidence. It's not the data. It's the lenses. It's the presupposition. It's how we interpret the evidence, because the evidence is the same. So if you don't love God, all the evidence in the world won't convince you that God loves you. God can do all kinds of acts of kindness for you, and he does for unbelievers. He gives them rain, he gives them breath, he gives them food. And yet they don't love him. Why? All the evidence in the world can't convince you that God loves you if you don't love God. Because worldviews are not just about the mental part of our hearts, the intellect, the mind. It's also about all the other parts of our heart. In Hebrews 11:3, Mark Ward mentions that the key to understanding truth is faith. The writer of Hebrews says that by faith we understand the worlds were made by the word of God. So he's acknowledging our Christian worldview is based on faith. In Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you want to be wise, it starts with the fear of the Lord, which basically is another way of saying you've got to love God with all of your heart. And if you don't love God with all of your heart, you will never attain to truth. Now, you can come to some truth. You can be a great historian. You can be a great cultural anthropologist. You can be a wonderful architect. You can be a fantastic teacher. You can make great discoveries in science. But you'll never arrive at the correct answers to the biggest questions in life if it doesn't start with the fear of the Lord. If you don't love God, you will never know ultimate truth. And that brings us to the last reality about worldview, is that every worldview reveals the treasure of the heart of the one who holds it. My worldview reveals what I treasure. Your neighbor's worldview reveals what they treasure. The Jehovah's Witness that you encounter at your door, their worldview reveals what they treasure. Because we want to just limit it to the intellectual part of the heart, the mind. These are the facts I believe, and that's it. But your worldview affects every part of your heart. Your worldview affects your emotions, because you're going to be passionate if you truly believe something. You're going to be passionate about it. It also affects your will, that part of your heart, the choices that you make. So if people are made in the image of God, then you can't treat them any way that you want to. But most fundamentally, your worldview reveals what you treasure. What is important to you? That's what your worldview reveals. If you're a hedonist at heart and just living for pleasure, then you're going to find a worldview that fits that. So what kind of worldview questions are we talking about? What questions reveal what your worldview is? How can you evaluate a worldview? Well, it's based on what they do with these types of questions. This list is not exhaustive, but it's a pretty good start. These 10 questions here. Every worldview has to wrestle with, is there a God? Or is there a higher power of some sorts? And if so, what is he, she, or it like? Second, where did our planet come from? How did it get here? Every worldview has to interact with that. If it doesn't interact with that question, it's not going to be a very satisfactory or comprehensive worldview. But also then, number three, what is wrong with our planet? Why is it so messed up? It's not just Christians that have to answer that question. Every worldview has to answer that question. What's wrong with our planet? Humanity. What's the essence of humanity? Number four, who are we? Are we random collections of atoms? Are we gods ourselves? Are we creatures? Who are we? And number five, how did we get here? What are we doing here at this point? Connected to that, number six, what's our purpose? What's the meaning of history? Why is all this happening? Is there a point to all of this? Naturalism would basically have to say, no, there's not. Is there good and evil? And if so, what's the purpose of evil? Every worldview has to wrestle with the fact of why is there so much pain? And if there is a God, why would he allow this kind of pain? Number eight, how can we know right and wrong? Is there right and wrong? And if so, how would we know what is right and what is wrong? Number nine, does the supernatural occur? In other words, are there miracles? Are there spirits? Are there things that we can't see? Or is what we can see the limit of what is in existence? And number 10, what happens after death? Is there life after death? How do you prepare for it? These are the types of questions that reveal a person's worldview. So some of these basic worldviews that Sire covers in The Universe Next Door. Deism. We'll examine a lot of these, survey a lot of these this semester. Deism, naturalism, nihilism, existentialism, or nihilism, existentialism, pantheism, New Ageism, postmodernism, Islamic theism, Christian theism. There are a lot of options, and sometimes people mix and mingle. But there's not an unlimited amount of worldviews because every worldview has the same basic questions that they have to answer. So what kind of worldview is desirable? Well, Sire points out that you want a worldview that's logically consistent. If you have a worldview that contains contradictions, logical contradictions, that's not a very satisfying worldview, is it? You want a worldview that's comprehensive. In other words, it deals with the data that we have through our conscience, supernatural events, history, science. You want a worldview also that corresponds to reality. In other words, one that's true. And this is what happens sometimes, is that people begin to question, they get uneasy about their worldview because they see logical contradictions. So, for instance, sometimes Mormons start examining what their church teaches a little more closely, and they start to see the contradictions in it, and it drives them to reevaluate their worldview. Because frankly, some worldviews are quite unsatisfactory. And if that's your case, if you're a non-believer here or part of a liberal Christian church or a cult group, I want you to examine your worldview this semester. I want you to take a closer look at it. You can't just go into eternity not having critically thought about what you profess to believe and whether it matches truth, if it corresponds to reality. For instance, naturalists have a dilemma. Ward says, it doesn't make any sense to call anything in the world right or wrong if we are all random atom collections. So, somebody who doesn't believe that God exists and yet tries to treat people with kindness, they're living inconsistently with their worldview. Because if God doesn't exist, then It doesn't matter how you treat anybody else. You can do what you want to do. You can do what you believe is best for you if God doesn't exist. So if we're just a bunch of random atom collections, then I can take advantage of you. I can slander you. I can hurt you. I can rob from you. I can even kill you, and it doesn't really matter. But if God exists, if the Christian worldview is correct, then my experience corresponds to reality. Ward points out, you don't want to live in a world where you can't call anything evil. If what Kim Jong-un is doing in North Korea and what is happening in Myanmar, if we can't call those things evil, if we don't have any framework in our worldview for calling something evil without being inconsistent with our worldview, then that's not a worldview that you want to live in. But you also want a worldview that provides hope. A lot of these worldviews that people believe are very fatalistic and very depressing. And one of the blessings of the Christian worldview is that it is a worldview of hope. It doesn't minimize sin. It doesn't minimize fallenness. It doesn't minimize the brokenness of our planet. It acknowledges those realities, but it provides hope that one day Jesus is going to fix it. A worldview that's satisfying is a worldview that provides hope, that's grounded in reality. Can I challenge you here, Christian parents, to seek to instill in your children a biblical worldview? Your kids are developing a worldview right now. As their brains are developing, they are developing a worldview. And unfortunately, for many kids in Christian families, the bulk of their worldview is given to them by secular teachers at school, by TV shows, by video games. If we are not intentional about instilling in our kids a biblical worldview, then they will likely adopt the culture around them, the worldview around them. Kids need guidance on who they are to shape their thinking about gender issues that are front and center in our day. They need guidance about why they are here, and that will help them as they make decisions about what to study and what career to pursue. They need guidance about the purpose of evil and why God allows it, so that they can respond to the hard times that they are facing and will face as they grow older. And this is why many parents decide to homeschool their kids. It's not the right fit for every Christian family. Sometimes the mom is just not equipped to do that, or maybe it's a single parent home and it's not an option. I went to a great Christian school. My wife went to a great Christian school, and that can be a wonderful option for some folks, but in a lot of places, there just isn't a Christian school that has a thoroughly biblical worldview, because most Christian schools today teach theistic evolution. They try and mix contradictory worldviews. And some folks do just fine in the public schools, but you know as well as I do that in most places, public schools are just a disaster. Not just externally, but in the ideology, what they're teaching the kids, how they're teaching the kids to view other people, explaining where we came from and why we are here and what we're allowed to do. And so some Christian parents have chosen homeschooling. And one of the reasons that it's on the rise is because of this idea of a Christian worldview. It's that we want our kids to have a distinctively Christian worldview. Now, homeschooling doesn't automatically mean that's going to happen. Your kid, depending on the situation, may come through a public school with a Christian worldview, and I pray that by God's grace they will. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But whether your kids are homeschooled, public schooled, or in or in a Christian school, you've got to work hard to try and instill in them a biblical worldview. And kids, if you have parents that are doing that for you, then you have much to be grateful for, because very few kids in our world have that. So what's the point of this course this semester? You don't have to take the quizzes. You don't have to read the reading, though that'll help you and profit you to think through some of these things on your own. But even if you just watch the lessons, I'd be grateful for that. But I want this course to accomplish several things. First of all, I want you to become aware of your worldview. I don't want you to be one of those people that doesn't know exactly what your worldview is. Think through what your worldview is. I want you to be self-aware of why you do what you do and why you view the world the way that you do. Why do you believe what you believe? Why do you think that your worldview is true? Whether that's the biblical worldview, or a deistic worldview, or an existentialist, or a pantheistic, or a postmodern worldview. Why do you believe what you believe is true? Examine that. Second, I hope this course will strengthen your confidence in the biblical worldview. One writer says that the true story of our world will work. It won't tell you to believe what your everyday experiences tell you is false. The Christian worldview is the only worldview that works. It's the only worldview that satisfactorily accounts for all of the data. And that doesn't mean there aren't difficulties. That doesn't mean we're not learning and still growing, but we have an objective source of truth in the Bible that is a satisfying worldview. And it makes sense of the world that we live in. And then third, I want this course to challenge you to think whether your actions are consistent with your professed worldview. Most of you watching this probably would claim a Christian worldview, but we don't always live that out. Sometimes our walk doesn't match our talk. And I hope that through this course you'll be encouraged that if my testimony is going to be effective as I earnestly contend for the faith, and as 1 Peter 3 says, I give an answer for the hope that I have. If I say the right things with my lips, but my life doesn't back it up, if I say, we have hope as Christians, and then I'm always down in the dumps at work, my walk doesn't match my talk, and people probably aren't going to believe what I say. They're going to believe what I do. And so I want all of us to examine whether our actions are consistent with our professed Christian worldview. What did Jesus say about truth? Didn't he say that it was truth that would set us free? And he wasn't just talking about intellectually saying, yes, I believe that, though that's part of it, because that's part of the heart. When he said, you will know the truth, he wasn't just saying you say you believe it. He was saying you've had a personal experience with it. You love truth. It's your treasure because you love the greatest being in the universe. You experience that, so you treasure God, and then that affects the way you think, your worldview, which then affects the choices that you make, your will, which then affects your emotions, joy, love, and peace. Everything starts in the heart. So thank you so much for your time tonight, friends. We're going to shift over to Zoom for anyone from our church family that would like to ask any questions about this. I hope this has been helpful for you, and we'll look forward to examining a Christian worldview this semester together.